Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of New Orleans. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and what time of day you found this story. It's strange how these forgotten lives still reach across centuries to find new ears. The year was 1846. In the humid quarters of New Orleans, where the Mississippi curved like a bent silver ribbon, the Rowan family held one of the most respected households in the French Quarter. Their three-story home on Royal Street, with its wrought iron balconies and courtyard fountain, stood as a monument to generations of wealth built on the sugar and shipping trades. It was there, on the evening of September 9th, that Julian Rowan was last seen in the company of a free woman of color named Celeste Harwood. By morning, neither of them could be found. The search that followed would uncover hidden rooms, sealed doors, and a secret that some of the most prominent families in Louisiana conspired to bury. What baffled investigators from the very beginning was a single woman's shoe, a satin slipper found in the middle of Royal Street, 3 blocks from the Rowan home. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuff marks, no blood. It was simply there, as if its owner had dissolved into the thick southern air. Even stranger was a monogrammed handkerchief discovered nearby, bearing the initials JR, marked not with blood, but with traces of candle wax and a faint smear of river clay. How had these items traveled so far from where the couple was last seen? And why did 6 different witnesses claim to hear a woman singing from behind the sealed walls of St. Louis Cathedral that same night? The Rowan family's history stretched back to the earliest days of French colonization. George Rowan, Julian's grandfather, had arrived in Louisiana in 1728 with little more than ambition and a keen sense for opportunity. By 1750, he had built a thriving enterprise exporting sugar, cotton, and indigo to Europe. His fortune grew alongside the city's expansion. By the mid-1800s, the Rowans had moved beyond trade into politics, banking, and land. Their name had become synonymous with old money and quiet power. Julian was the only male heir, 26 years old, recently returned from his studies in Paris. He was reserved, methodical, and unfailingly polite. Those who knew him called him serious rather than charming, but his fortune and family name made him one of the most eligible bachelors in New Orleans. He was engaged to Margaret Willoughby, daughter of a prominent cotton broker, and their wedding was planned for the spring of 1847. Celeste Harwood's story was different. Born to a French merchant and a free woman of color in 1820, she belonged to that delicate class known as gens de couleur libre, the free people of color who occupied an uneasy space between privilege and oppression in antebellum New Orleans. She owned a small millinery shop on Chartres Street, catering to the city's elite women, both white and colored. Her mother had died young, leaving her the business and a modest property near Rampart Street. By all accounts, Celeste was educated, graceful, and strikingly beautiful. How she and Julian first met remains uncertain. What we know is that on the evening of September 9, 1846, Julian received a visitor shortly after 8 o'clock. The butler, Thomas Wells, later told police that the visitor was a woman in a dark blue dress and bonnet. She introduced herself only as Miss Harwood, saying she wished to speak with Mr. Rowan on a private matter. Wells showed her to the small parlor and fetched his employer. According to his sworn statement, Julian seemed surprised but not displeased. He ordered sherry and instructed that they were not to be disturbed. Around 10:30 that night, the housekeeper, Mary Sullivan, passed the parlor door and heard 2 voices in what she described as an intense but calm conversation. The lamp still burned within. That was the last confirmed sighting of either Julian or Celeste. By morning, the parlor was empty. The sherry decanter was nearly drained. 2 glasses had been used. The lamp had burned itself out. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing to suggest violence. Both Julian and Celeste had vanished, as if the night had swallowed them whole. At first, the Rowan family treated the disappearance as a private affair. Julian's father, Edward Rowan, questioned the staff, but did not immediately alert the city watch. It wasn't until Margaret Willoughby's family inquired about Julian's absence from a scheduled luncheon that the matter began to spread through society circles. Even then, The family might have kept things quiet had it not been for the discovery of the handkerchief and the satin slipper. Both items were turned over to authorities by a street vendor early the next morning. The initials JR were recognized instantly. With no other choice, Edward Rowan filed a missing persons report. The investigation had officially begun, but what would follow revealed something far darker than a simple disappearance. The Rowan estate stood on land that had once belonged to the Tremaine plantation, and long before that, to the Choctaw people. Some said the ground was sacred, others called it cursed. City records show that during construction of the Rowan home in 1793, workers unearthed a shallow grave containing the remains of at least a dozen people. The discovery was quietly covered up, mentioned only in the private journal of the French architect, François Latreille, whose notes were not found until 1960, hidden in the attic of the Cabildo. Weeks passed with no new leads. Investigators questioned staff, associates, and neighbors. Celeste's shop remained locked, her accounts untouched. Julian's personal effects, his watch, letters, and bank papers, all sat neatly arranged in his room. No one had withdrawn funds from his accounts. There was no sign either had planned to run away. The case might have faded quietly had it not been for one man, Father Anthony Mancini, an Italian-born priest serving at St. Louis Cathedral. He knew Celeste from morning mass and described her as devout, disciplined, and unusually burdened by unseen worry in the months before her disappearance. In a letter to Bishop Antoine Blanc, dated October 23, 1846, Father Mancini pleaded for permission to make inquiries among his parishioners. Through those quiet conversations, the priest began to assemble a picture of Celeste's life that the city watch had overlooked, a pattern of fear, a woman who believed she was being followed, and her strange meetings with an older Creole woman named Madame Laveau, rumored to have ties to the famous Marie Laveau herself. And then came the discovery that shifted everything. A baptismal record dated April 4, 1820, listing Celeste Harwood's godfather as George Rowan, Julian's own grandfather. The connection ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Father Mancini's discovery of that baptismal record was more than coincidence. It was the thread that began to unravel a century of silence. The document, yellowed and brittle, recorded the christening of Celeste Harwood, daughter of Francois Harwood, and Dominique, a free woman of color. But it was the signature of the godfather that froze the priest's hand, George Rowan, grandfather of Julian. It meant the two families' connection stretched back more than 2 decades before the disappearance. A link hidden in plain sight, buried under the delicate social codes of New Orleans' divided society. Father Mancini noted his finding in a private journal, writing, "The sins of the father seem destined to revisit the son, and perhaps the daughter as well." He intended to continue his inquiries, but within days he received an unexpected visitor. On the evening of November 10th, Edward Rowan, Julian's father, arrived unannounced at the priest's modest quarters behind St. Louis Cathedral. Mancini later recorded that the visit was brief, polite, but unmistakably threatening. Edward thanked him for his concern, yet advised that further curiosity will serve neither family nor faith. He assured the priest that Julian and Miss Harwood had likely eloped to Cuba or perhaps even France. Before departing, Edward left an envelope containing a donation of $500. Exactly the amount needed to fund the cathedral's long-delayed repairs on the north wall. That same wall, workers later reported, was the source of faint sounds, murmuring, almost singing, heard at night after that evening. Official interest in the disappearance began to fade. The City Watch closed the case before the year's end, citing a lack of evidence of foul play. The Daily Picayune published a short notice claiming that Mr. Julian Rowan was last seen boarding a vessel bound for Marseille. No such passenger list was ever found. Celeste's shop was quietly sold to pay unspecified debts, and by early 1847, the story of the vanished lovers slipped beneath the surface of polite conversation, reduced to whispers traded over tea, dismissed as scandal or superstition. Then, in January of 1847, a fire broke out in the Rowan mansion. It began in the East Wing, in the same parlor where Julian and Celeste had last been seen, and spread swiftly before being contained. The cause was ruled accidental, a tipped oil lamp. Yet what the fire revealed was far more curious. When reconstruction began that spring, workers discovered a hidden door behind a floor-to-ceiling bookcase. The door opened onto a narrow, windowless corridor, leading to a small chamber no larger than a pantry. Inside was a single wooden chair, bolted to the floor, and an empty oil lamp fixed to the wall. The find was noted in the builder's report, but no further investigation was made. The chamber was resealed when renovations were completed. Years passed. The Rowan family maintained their social standing, though their fortune waned. Edward died in 1854, leaving the estate to his son-in-law, Thomas Beaumont, who had married Julian's sister, Marie-Claire Rowan. The story of Julian's disappearance softened into legend. That he'd gone to Europe, overcome with heartbreak, never to return, no letters ever arrived. No trace of him was found. Celeste vanished even more completely. No census record, no tax rolls, no grave. Only a single satin shoe left in the middle of Royal Street, as though she had stepped into thin air. But New Orleans has a long memory, and the dead never stay silent forever. In 1892, nearly half a century later, an elderly woman named Sarah Johnson gave an interview to a reporter from the Times-Democrat, who was collecting stories of old New Orleans. She had once worked as a laundress for several prominent families, including the Rowans. Sarah spoke of a night she could never forget. It was late September 1846. She was walking home past the Rowan mansion after delivering linens to the Willoughby house when she saw two figures in the garden, a man and a woman. The man, she said, was Julian Rowan. The woman, whose back was turned, wore a long dark dress and bonnet. They stood near the old garden well, long since covered but still part of the courtyard's decor. The man gestured angrily toward the well. The woman stood motionless. Sarah remembered one detail most clearly: Julian pointing toward a single brick in the garden wall, darker than the others, as though marked by soot or age. Her story might have been dismissed as the confusion of an old woman had it not been for what happened decades later. In 1928, during a storm, part of that same garden wall collapsed. Behind the loosened bricks, workers found a small corroded metal box. Inside were fragments of a leather-bound journal, the handwriting confirmed to be Julian Rowan's. Only a few lines were legible. C has confirmed what I long suspected. The room beneath the east parlor connects to the old tunnel. Father must be confronted with this knowledge, though I fear the consequences. The papers she found leave no doubt about the events of 1820. That entry, dated September 7, 1846, suggested a meeting planned just 2 days before Julian and Celeste disappeared. What were the events of 1820? Historians noted that the year matched not only Celeste's birth, but also a devastating yellow fever outbreak and the introduction of stricter laws limiting the rights of free people of color. But the most disturbing connection came from newly uncovered business ledgers. In 1820, George Rowan had overseen the importation of sugar shipments from Havana. Yet several ship manifests were missing from his otherwise meticulous records. Those months coincided with a surge in enslaved laborers, arriving illegally from the Caribbean, despite the trade being banned since 1808. Some whispered that George Rowan had been part of that illicit traffic, hiding the trade behind false bills of lading. Others believed the tunnels beneath the French Quarter, narrow passageways discovered beneath several old estates, had once carried not only contraband sugar but people. When city engineers excavated part of Royal Street in 1958, they uncovered a section of that same tunnel, 3 feet wide, 9 feet underground, stretching nearly 30 yards before caving in. It led directly toward the property that had once belonged to the Rowan family. Whatever secret Julian and Celeste stumbled upon in 1846, it was powerful enough to destroy them both. And that secret, buried beneath a house of wealth and prayer, would continue to draw the curious and the doomed for generations to come. By the time the 20th century began, the Rowan case had become little more than a whisper, an unsolved mystery folded into the broader legend of old New Orleans. But beneath the folklore, in the dusty archives of Tulane University, a few researchers refused to let the story die. One of them was Martha Gaines, a graduate student in historical anthropology in the early 1960s. Her thesis would reopen a case that had been silent for more than a century, and, some said would ultimately consume her. Gaines spent months combing through church registries, property deeds, and private correspondence, piecing together fragments of lives erased by time. What she discovered was a pattern of transactions that tied the Harwood and Rowan families together more tightly than anyone had realized. The baptismal link Father Mancini had uncovered decades earlier was only the beginning. Gaines found that Celeste's mother, Dominique Harwood, had once been enslaved, not by some distant stranger, but by George Rowan himself. She was granted her freedom in 1817, 3 years before Celeste's birth. But the manumission record did not stand alone. It was accompanied by a ledger entry, a payment of $400 made to Francois Harwood, a French merchant, dated 3 months before Dominique's emancipation. Beneath the amount, George Rowan had scrawled the phrase, "family obligations," to be maintained quarterly. The quarterly payments continued until Dominique's death in 1836. They were categorized under household maintenance, the same heading under which George listed his legitimate family's expenses. The implication was clear, though unspoken. Celeste Harwood was not simply a family acquaintance. She was George Rowan's natural daughter, making her Julian's aunt, though only 6 years his senior. Such tangled arrangements were not unusual in antebellum New Orleans, a city where the lines between races, classes, and families often blurred behind closed shutters. Wealthy white men frequently kept secondary households with free women of color, providing for their children quietly, indirectly. But the Rowan case was different. Something had broken the silent compact. Gaines proposed that Celeste, while sorting through her late mother's papers, discovered proof of her lineage, and perhaps more, evidence of her grandfather's illegal dealings. Her research pointed to one possibility that few dared to write openly about, that George Rowan's fortune, like many in that era, had been built on illegal slave trading. Even after the transatlantic trade was banned, clandestine shipments continued, facilitated by tunnels leading from the riverfront to private warehouses beneath the French Quarter. The tunnel uncovered in 1958 beneath the former Rowan property fit the pattern precisely. Built around 1810 to 1820, it had been reinforced with oak timbers, far sturdier than needed for simple storage. If Celeste had uncovered documents connecting the family to such trade, and if Julian had confronted his father with that evidence, the implications were devastating. Social ruin was the least of it. Criminal prosecution and even execution was possible under federal law. But there was something else. Something darker, hinted at in the few surviving fragments of Julian's journal. One passage, barely legible, read, "Grandfather's dealings with the dead were not merely commerce. The rites beneath the house must never be repeated." Historians dismissed it as metaphor, the fevered musings of a guilt-ridden heir. But Gaines wasn't so sure. She tracked down a long-forgotten document, the private journal of the French architect François Latreille, the same man who designed the Rowan mansion in 1793. His entry from that year described how workers uncovered a mass grave during construction. 15 bodies, arranged not as if buried but placed with care, as in ritual. Latreille wrote that George Rowan personally oversaw the reburial and paid the men to speak of it to no one. He hinted that certain artifacts found among the remains were taken into Rowan's possession. The tone of the journal changed abruptly after that entry, as if the architect himself had grown uneasy. He never again mentioned the site. Gaines concluded that what Celeste discovered in her mother's papers may have been not only proof of her bloodline, but a record of something far older and far darker, a secret buried beneath the foundations of the Rowan home itself. She traced property purchases made by Edward Rowan, Julian's father, in the weeks after the disappearance. One, dated September 18, 1846, stood out, a parcel of remote swampland in St. Bernard Parish, home to an abandoned sugar mill. Edward never developed the property. It was sold after his death. No explanation was ever recorded for why he had bought it. To Gaines, the meaning was unmistakable. The property, isolated and accessible by boat, offered the perfect place to hide what should never be found. In June 1962, she completed her thesis, The Rowan Harwood Disappearance, a Study in Race, Power and historical erasure. Her advisors praised it as meticulous and daring. They encouraged her to expand it into a book. 3 months later, she and her research assistant, Robert Kleinman, drove to St. Bernard Parish to conduct a small archaeological survey near the old mill site. They never returned. Their car was found abandoned near the edge of the bayou, keys still in the ignition. Authorities searched for weeks, dragging the swamps, interviewing locals, but no trace of either researcher was ever found. Their disappearance was officially ruled a tragic accident. Perhaps they had drowned. But those familiar with the Rowan case couldn't shake the feeling that history had repeated itself. The university sealed Gaines's research materials as part of the investigation. When the case was closed 7 years later, the documents were quietly archived, restricted under a confidential agreement with an unnamed third party. For decades, no one saw them again. Then, in 2004, a Freedom of Information request forced their partial release. Sections were heavily redacted, especially those referring to specific land records in St. Bernard Parish. But enough survived to confirm one thing. Martha Gaines had been close, perhaps dangerously close, to uncovering what happened beneath the Rowan estate. Her last handwritten note, recovered from her university office, contained a single line. The truth is not buried in one grave, but in many. For nearly 40 years after Martha Gaines's disappearance, the Rowan case slept again. But New Orleans is a city that does not forget. Secrets buried in its soil have a way of resurfacing, and by the late 1990s, strange whispers had begun to circle once more around the old Rowan property. After changing hands countless times, the house had been converted into a boutique. Hotel, its owners quick to capitalize on its reputation as one of the quarter's most haunted addresses. Guests spoke of soft singing echoing through the east wing, and the scent of candle wax and river mud drifting through sealed rooms. In 1997, during a round of renovations, workers claimed to uncover a sealed cavity behind a plaster wall near the old parlor. Inside, they reported finding fragments of a woman's slipper, identical in design to the one documented in 1846. Pale satin, embroidered with faded gold thread. The find was never officially catalogued. By the time local historians inquired, the item had vanished. The following year, a new clue emerged from an unexpected source. In the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society, a retired librarian named Eleanor Whitfield stumbled upon a red leather household ledger belonging to Marie Claire Beaumont, Julian's sister. The entries covered routine expenses between 1845 and 1847, candles, silver polish, wages, until one peculiar note dated September 10, 1846 caught her eye. Payment to Dr. James Vernon for night services and discretion, $150. Dr. Vernon, as Whitfield soon discovered, was not a physician of the living. His work concerned the preparation of the dead, what would now be called a mortician. That a doctor of the dead had been summoned to the Rowan house the very night Julian and Celeste vanished, and paid a considerable sum for his discretion, was too precise to ignore. Whitfield documented her findings meticulously, intending to present them at an upcoming conference. But before she could, she suffered a sudden stroke. She died 3 weeks later, her notes incomplete. The ledger was returned to storage, its significance buried under a century of paperwork. It would remain unnoticed until the late 1970s, when the Historical Society finally digitized its records. The ledger was listed in the inventory, the key entry buried amid hundreds of household expenditures. Its connection to the Rowan mystery, once again, overlooked. This pattern had repeated itself for generations, evidence surfacing briefly, only to be lost, ignored, or destroyed. Not through malice, perhaps, but through something subtler, the city's instinct to protect its own history from itself. Still, the fragments continued to reappear. In 1982, while restoring St. Louis Cathedral, construction workers discovered a small cavity within the north wall, the same section Father Mancini had overseen repairs on in 1846, funded by Edward Rowan's suspiciously generous donation. Inside the cavity was a tarnished silver locket, containing a miniature portrait of a young woman with mixed African and European features. On the reverse, an inscription, CH, until we meet in a better world. Church records show the locket was turned over to the archdiocese. But when researchers inquired decades later, no trace of it could be found. Officials denied any record of such an object ever existing. It was as if the city itself refused to let the story end, or begin again. By the turn of the 21st century, what had started as a forgotten disappearance was now the centerpiece of ghost tours and amateur documentaries. Guides spoke of the lover's curse of Royal Street, reducing the tragedy to romantic legend. The real history, race, power, exploitation, was airbrushed into a tale of forbidden love. It was easier that way. But in 2015, a forensic anthropology student at Tulane named Darius Washington revisited the case with a modern lens. Working from photographs and old police inventories, he applied forensic soil analysis to the only remaining clue, the description of the river clay found on Julian's monogrammed handkerchief. The composition, Washington discovered, matched a very specific area, a section of riverbank less than a quarter-mile from where the Rowan property once stood. More importantly, it lay directly in line with the underground tunnel unearthed in 1958. The evidence suggested that whatever happened to Julian and Celeste, the answer lay somewhere between that tunnel and the Mississippi's dark water. Washington also studied the original blueprints of the Rowan home. Comparing them with post-1847 renovation plans, he noticed something chilling. The basement, originally extending the full length of the east wing, appeared 15 feet shorter in the later plans. The missing section corresponded exactly with the area above the discovered tunnel. In other words, an entire portion of the house had been sealed off after the fire. Further, digital enhancement of Julian's journal fragment, the one found in the corroded box in 1928, revealed a partial sentence, previously thought illegible. Grandfather's involvement in the rites beneath the house must be exposed, no matter the cost to our name. The word rites raised disturbing implications. What had once seemed like metaphor, the dealings with the dead mentioned in Julian's writing, now appeared to be literal. Was the mass grave found in 1793 truly accidental? Or had the land beneath the Rowan house been used for something older, something ritualistic, the kind of secret that families of influence could keep buried for generations? Washington was careful not to draw conclusions, but his research revived interest in the case across the country. The Rowan mystery was no longer just a story of forbidden love or class scandal. It had become a lens into how history itself erases the uncomfortable, the shameful and the terrifying. Still, physical evidence remained elusive. The St. Bernard Parish property, the likely burial site, if one existed, had been obliterated by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The sugar mill, untouched for 150 years, was reduced to rubble and mud. Yet one final, eerie artifact emerged from the wreckage. A local cleanup worker discovered a small iron key, corroded but still legible, stamped with a single letter, R. It was turned over to parish authorities, and then disappeared from evidence storage before it could be examined. By then, it hardly surprised anyone. The Rowan mystery had become something larger than itself, a mirror reflecting the city's uneasy relationship with its own past. Each attempt to uncover the truth seemed to end the same way, with loss, disappearance, or silence. And still, for those who walk past the old house on Royal Street at night, some say the silence does not hold. They claim to hear a woman humming behind the courtyard wall, or the faint creak of a chair on the other side of the plaster where no room exists. By the late 2010s, the Rowan mystery had transformed from a local curiosity into a subject of national fascination. Academics, podcasters, and paranormal investigators descended on New Orleans, each convinced they could uncover the truth. None could agree on what had really happened on that September night in 1846. But one theme kept recurring: silence. Deliberate and constructed, in 2019, a descendant of the Beaumont family, the line descending from Julian's sister Marie-Claire, granted researchers access to a cache of private letters stored in her attic for over a century. The correspondence, written between 1860 and 1870, offered the first personal glimpse into the family's guarded inner world. One letter, dated March 12, 1867, caught historians' attention. Marie Claire wrote to her daughter Elizabeth, "Today would have been Julian's 50th birthday. I still dream of him, standing by the old well, trying to tell me something I cannot quite hear." Father took the truth of that night to his grave, and perhaps that is best. Some burdens are too heavy for us to carry. The mention of the garden well electrified researchers. The well had been described in Sarah Johnson's 1892 interview and in early architectural drawings, but no one had ever linked it directly to the night of the disappearance. Just 2 years after Julian and Celeste vanished, in October 1846, city records showed an invoice submitted to Davenport and Kerber Builders for filling and sealing of courtyard well with lime, stone and cement, permanent closure. The client, Edward Rowan. That invoice, preserved in a box of municipal archives, had gone unnoticed until a digitization project in 2021 brought it to light. The timing was unmistakable, barely a month after the disappearance. The question that haunted investigators was simple. Why would anyone fill an active well so completely, so suddenly, unless it had become contaminated or used for something far worse? The evidence formed a pattern too neat to ignore. Julian and Celeste vanish. A doctor who specializes in preparing the dead is paid for his discretion. Weeks later, the parlor burns. Months later, the garden well is sealed forever. By the time modern historians connected these facts, the well had been buried under layers of renovation. No excavation was possible without demolishing the courtyard. The current owners refused all requests. They insisted that the ghost stories were just good for business. Still, the whispers grew louder. In 2022, during a city maintenance project to reinforce the old storm drains beneath Royal Street, workers reported a strange cavity beneath the asphalt, directly opposite the former Rowan property. When surveyed, the hollow matched the size and trajectory of the tunnel discovered in 1958. Engineers described the air from within as stale, metallic and sweet, the scent of long-closed chambers, before any archaeological team could examine it. The cavity was filled with concrete for safety. The official report labeled it non-significant structural void. The pattern repeated itself yet again, discovery followed by erasure. For scholars who study historical disappearance, the Rowan case became a textbook example of what they called systemic forgetting, the process by which institutions, intentionally or not, collaborate to obscure uncomfortable truths. A young historian at Tulane, Dr. Lillian Torres, described it best in a 2023 lecture. What happened to Julian and Celeste is not just a crime story. It's a study in how societies protect their myths. Every generation of New Orleans has encountered fragments of this case, and each time, those fragments have been quietly reburied. The silence itself is the evidence. Torres's team compiled all known artifacts: the slipper, the handkerchief, the journal fragment, the locket, the ledger entry, the sealed well, the vanished key. Together they formed the outline of something intentional, an operation to erase not just two people, but a truth capable of shaking the social order of an entire era. That truth, the records suggest, lay in whatever rites beneath the house Julian mentioned in his final journal entry. The word rites appeared again in a later family document, a letter written by Edward Rowan to Judge William Harper, dated September 15, 1846, discovered among courthouse papers in 1988. The letter referred cryptically to completing the rite of silence, as our fathers once did. No historian has ever explained what the phrase meant, but the combination of burial imagery, hidden tunnels, and the mass grave, discovered during the mansion's construction, suggests that the Rowans' wealth may have rested not only on the exploitation of human labor, but on rituals meant to sanctify or conceal it. In the decades following emancipation, oral traditions among black families in the French Quarter spoke of the house where the songs stopped, a place where enslaved voices were silenced beneath the floorboards. Whether that memory referred to the Rowan estate or to another of the city's labyrinthine mansions remains unclear. But the echo is impossible to ignore. Every generation seemed to brush against the truth, only for the trail to vanish again. Father Mancini's notes disappeared into diocesan archives. Martha Gaines's field notes were sealed. The locket was lost. The iron key vanished, and yet the story refused to die. In the spring of 2024, a team of archivists digitizing private collections for the New Orleans Historical Preservation Society, stumbled upon one final piece of the puzzle. Among the Beaumont family's unsorted belongings lay a small wooden box labeled simply Royal Street, Do Not Open. Inside was a folded parchment, brittle, water-stained but legible. It was a letter unsigned, dated September 13, 1846. The handwriting matched that of Dr. James Vernon. "The young lady is prepared." The man resisted until the end. "I have done as instructed. The well must be sealed before morning. I shall expect the remainder of my payment." The discovery was explosive. Handwriting experts confirmed its authenticity, but within weeks, the document's whereabouts became uncertain. The Preservation Society reported it had been temporarily removed for evaluation. When journalists requested access, they were told the letter was under review for provenance. As of today, its location remains undisclosed. To some, the cycle of discovery and disappearance has become proof of a lingering curse. To others, it is simply the machinery of power still grinding, long after the men who built it are gone. Yet one fact endures. In a city of parades and jazz, of saints and sinners, of light and shadow, the Rowan case stands apart not for its ghosts, but for its silences. For nearly 2 centuries, New Orleans has told stories to keep itself from remembering this one too clearly. The slipper on Royal Street, the singing behind the cathedral wall, the well that was sealed before dawn. And somewhere beneath that courtyard, beneath the limestone and cement, lies whatever remains of the truth. In the years that followed, the Rowan mystery became less about the missing and more about what their absence revealed. Historians, journalists, and even skeptics agreed on one thing. The case exposed a machinery of silence that had operated in New Orleans for generations, an unspoken agreement between power, wealth, and memory. By the time Darius Washington published his final paper in 2025, the story of Julian Rowan and Celeste Harwood had crossed from folklore into something more enduring. A cautionary reflection on what a city chooses to remember, and what it works so carefully to forget. Washington's report, titled Erasure as Preservation, The Rowan Disappearance Reconsidered, summarized the evidence that had surfaced over nearly 2 centuries. The tunnel connecting the house to the river, the sealed section of the basement, the ledger recording payments for discretion, the filled garden well, the vanished artifacts. The redacted archives, every piece fit together into a single, chilling pattern. A crime so deeply entwined with the structures of the time that solving it would have required dismantling the very society that produced it. His conclusion was stark. The disappearance of Julian Rowan and Celeste Harwood was not a singular act of violence, but a collective act of omission. It demonstrates how a community can conspire without ever meeting to forget. That sentence struck a chord, because in truth, the evidence of violence was everywhere, only hidden behind the polite veils of history, the fire that destroyed the East Wing. The doctor's midnight visit, the sealed chamber behind the bookcase, the garden well filled with lime and stone, the hush money donation to the cathedral, and perhaps most damningly, the silence of those who knew and chose not to ask. Yet despite this, the story refused to die. In the spring of 2026, while maintenance crews worked beneath Royal Street to update the stormwater system, a small collapse exposed what appeared to be part of the long-lost tunnel. Work halted immediately. Engineers reported a narrow corridor of brick, barely 3 feet high, leading toward the direction of the Mississippi. The chamber was filled with silt, but one object was recovered from the debris. A rusted silver pendant. Its clasp broken, the engraving still faintly visible. CH. It was logged, photographed, and sent to the New Orleans Historical Society. 2 weeks later, it was reported missing from evidence storage, as expected. To those who study forgotten cases, the loss was no surprise. Objects tied to the Rowan story never stayed still for long. They slipped through cracks in bureaucracy, vanished in floods, or simply could not be located. But what could never be erased were the words left behind. The journals, the letters, the faint confessions buried in ledgers and invoices. They formed a ghost map, faint, but undeniable, of what had really happened on that humid September night in 1846, Julian, and Celeste likely confronted Edward Rowan with the documents. Celeste had discovered proof that her mother had once been enslaved by George Rowan, proof that she was his blood, proof, too, of the tunnels beneath the house, and of what they were used for, the smuggling of human cargo long after it had been outlawed. Perhaps, as Julian's journal hinted, his father's fear was not merely of scandal, but of exposure to something older, something he believed sacred, the rites beneath the house. Whether those rites were the remnants of some colonial superstition, or simply a metaphor for the city's unholy commerce, no one can say, but the results were the same. 2 people disappeared, a family's legacy preserved, and a city allowed to forget. Almost. In 2027, a new exhibit opened at the historic New Orleans collection. It was called Erased, the Stories the City Tried to Forget. Among the artifacts were reproductions of documents long suppressed: the handkerchief, the journal fragment, the baptismal record. The exhibit did not name the Rowan family directly. Instead, it posed a single question across the wall in tall, stenciled letters. What does it mean when a city is built on silence? Visitors lingered there longer than anywhere else. Perhaps because in New Orleans, silence isn't absence, it's an echo. Today, the old Rowan mansion still stands on Royal Street, its walls painted pale yellow, its balconies heavy with iron lace. The courtyard fountain still trickles, though the well beside it has long been paved over. Guests report hearing the sound of footsteps pacing at night, soft, even measured. Others speak of a woman's humming, almost melodic, coming from the east wing where no rooms remain. Maintenance staff have stopped investigating the sounds. They say the walls are thick, the house old, the air full of tricks. But those who've lived there longest, the night guards, the caretakers, tell a different story. They say that sometimes around midnight, when the air is still and the river breeze moves through the shutters, the scent of wax and clay fills the corridor, and a single drop of water falls from nowhere to the marble floor. They say it leaves a mark that fades by morning. No one knows what to make of it. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. For historians, the Rowan case remains unsolved. Theories abound: secret societies, forbidden romance, racial scandal, ritual murder. But none of them can quite capture the heart of it, the way 2 people could vanish so completely and yet remain everywhere, in every shadowed courtyard and every whisper of the quarter. What endures is not the evidence, but the emptiness where evidence should be. That emptiness has a shape now, a handkerchief, a locket, a tunnel, a filled well, and in that silence, you can almost hear the city breathing. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since Julian Rowan and Celeste Harwood stepped into history and disappeared. Their names are not on any monument, their faces on no painting. But the city that tried to forget them cannot, because every act of erasure leaves its outline behind. Every buried truth leaves a scar in the record, and somewhere, deep beneath the plaster and stone of the old Royal Street house, that scar still bleeds. For those who listen closely enough, you can still hear it. The echo of a conversation that ended too soon. The creak of a chair in a sealed room. The drip of water falling into a well that has not been open for 180 years. And if you stand in that courtyard long enough, you might notice the faint outline of a slipper pressed into the flagstones. As though someone once stood there waiting. She never left. She never could. And perhaps, in that unclaimed silence, in that unfinished story, lies the truest history of New Orleans. A city built not only on music and memory, but on all the things it has chosen not to say.